2 microphones, no audience, no applause, no stage to escape from. This wasn't a talk show. This was a table where you couldn't hide behind laughter. Meghan Markle was used to telling her story, but this time, she was sitting across from someone who didn't come to listen politely. And that night, what began as a calm podcast conversation slowly turned into something no one had planned. The room was quiet. 2 women sat across from each other, microphones positioned carefully between them, soft lighting, bookshelves in the background, a small table with water glasses. Everything looked calm, controlled, almost intimate. But beneath that calm, something tense moved quietly through the space. Candace Owens sat upright, relaxed but alert. Her hands rested near the microphone, untouched by notes. Her gaze stayed fixed on her guest, not aggressive, not defensive, simply focused. Meghan Markle sat with her legs crossed, shoulders back, wearing a familiar expression. Composed, confident, practiced. It was the posture of someone who had spent years in front of cameras, someone used to shaping the narrative rather than responding to it. Candace began in a measured tone. "First of all, Meghan, thank you for agreeing to be here. People have heard a lot about you over the years. I wanted to hear from you directly." Meghan smiled, slightly tilting her head. "Of course, I'm glad to be here for an open conversation." The first minutes were smooth. Meghan spoke about media pressure, public scrutiny, and the emotional toll of being misunderstood. Her words were deliberate, her gestures controlled. She spoke with empathy, carefully guiding the listener toward her perspective. Candace didn't interrupt. She didn't nod excessively. She simply listened. That alone felt unusual. Meghan was used to interviews that pushed forward, redirected, softened the edges. Here, Candace waited, as if letting the story reveal itself. Then Candace leaned forward just slightly. "There's something I'm noticing," she said calmly. "You talk a lot about how things made you feel, but very little about why they happened." Meghan's eyebrows lifted, barely noticeable, but real. "What do you mean by that?" Candace didn't raise her voice. "I'm asking this," she said. "If at some point people stopped listening, was it only because the media was unfair? Or could it be because the story itself stopped convincing them?" The room went still. For a fraction of a second, Meghan's smile froze. She inhaled, steadying herself, eyes still locked forward. "People stopped listening," she replied, her tone now sharper, "because they lacked empathy. Not because I lacked truth." Candace nodded slowly. "That's one possibility," she said. "What's the other one?" Meghan's fingers tightened around the glass in front of her. That was the first crack. No voices were raised, no accusations made, but this was no longer an interview. It was the moment control began to shift, and Meghan Markle could feel it. Meghan took a slow sip of water, buying herself a second. The pause wasn't accidental, it was strategic. She had learned long ago that silence could be as powerful as words, sometimes more. When she spoke again, her voice was smooth, measured, almost reassuring. "I think it's easy," Meghan said, "to sit outside an experience and dissect it. But when you're inside it, when you're living it, things aren't so clean or theoretical." Candace didn't react the way most hosts would. She didn't soften her expression. She didn't rush to agree. Instead, she leaned back slightly and asked calmly, "Do you think criticism always comes from ignorance?" Meghan tilted her head again, that familiar gesture returning. "Not always, but in my case, often yes." Candace nodded once. "Okay, then let me ask this differently." She folded her hands. "You've spoken a lot about feeling silenced, but you've also had global platforms, primetime interviews, documentaries, best-selling projects. How does someone who's supposedly silenced keep being heard everywhere?" The air shifted. This time, Meghan didn't smile. "That's a very reductive way of looking at it," she replied. "Visibility doesn't equal freedom. Having a microphone doesn't mean you're actually being listened to." Candace met her gaze. "But listening goes both ways, doesn't it?" Meghan's jaw tightened. "I listen plenty," she said quickly. "I listen to marginalized voices. I listen to women who feel unseen. I listen to—" Candace gently raised a finger. "I don't doubt that. What I'm asking is whether you listen to people who disagree with you." For the first time since the podcast began, Meghan let out a small, sharp laugh. "Well," she said, "disagreement is fine. Disrespect isn't." Candace didn't miss a beat. Who decides which is which? The question landed heavier than it sounded. Meghan straightened in her chair. When people question my integrity, my intentions, my lived experience, that's not disagreement. That's dismissal. Candace's voice stayed steady. Or, she said, it's accountability. That word hung in the room. Accountability. Meghan's eyes narrowed slightly. There's a difference between accountability and cruelty. Agreed, Candace said. But there's also a difference between cruelty and discomfort. Meghan leaned forward now, her tone more defensive, more animated. So, what is this really about? She asked. Because it feels less like curiosity and more like interrogation. Candace didn't flinch. It's about patterns, she said. Every institution you've been part of is described as toxic once you leave it. Every disagreement becomes harm. Every critique becomes trauma. Meghan's fingers curled inward. That's incredibly unfair, she snapped. You're oversimplifying my life into talking points. Candace nodded slowly again. And you're framing every question as an attack. For a moment, neither spoke. The microphones picked up the quiet hum of the room, the faint clink of glass settling on wood. The tension was no longer subtle. It was unmistakable. Meghan broke the silence first. I came here in good faith, she said. I didn't come here to be accused. Candace's reply was calm but firm. And I didn't invite you here to applaud. That was it. The polite distance between them was gone. This wasn't about media anymore, or royalty, or narratives. This was about control, who held it, and who was losing it. And Meghan Markle could feel the conversation slipping into territory she could no longer choreograph. Meghan crossed her legs slowly, deliberately. It was a familiar move, composed on the surface, guarded underneath. But this time, the composure didn't quite land. You know, Meghan said, her voice tight but controlled. This is exactly what people mean when they talk about hostile environments disguised as honest conversation. Candace raised an eyebrow. Hostile how? You're framing me, Meghan replied. You're taking years of lived experience and flattening it into a narrative that suits your audience. Candace didn't interrupt. She let Meghan finish. And frankly, Meghan continued, it feels calculated. That was the word, calculated. Candace leaned forward now, resting her forearms lightly on her chair. Everything on this show is up front, she said. No ambush, no edits, no traps, just questions. Meghan shook her head. Questions with an agenda. Candace smiled faintly, but it wasn't warm. Every question has an agenda, she said. The difference is whether you're willing to answer it. The tension snapped tighter. Meghan exhaled through her nose. Why does it bother you so much, she asked, that a woman speaks about her pain? Candace didn't hesitate. It doesn't, she said. What bothers me is when pain becomes currency, and disagreement becomes heresy. Meghan's eyes flashed. That's incredibly dismissive. No, Candace replied calmly. It's analytical. Meghan leaned forward now, her voice sharper. You sit here judging choices you've never had to make. You weren't under global scrutiny. You didn't have your every move dissected. Candace met her gaze without blinking. I don't need a tiara to understand responsibility. The silence that followed was thick. Meghan let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. Wow, she said. So now we're doing sound bites. Candace shrugged lightly. You've done plenty of those yourself. That hit harder than Candace intended, or maybe exactly as intended. Meghan's posture stiffened. I've shared my truth, she said firmly, and I won't apologize for that. Candace nodded. I'm not asking you to apologize, she said. I'm asking whether you've ever considered that your truth might not be the whole truth. Meghan's lips parted slightly, then pressed together. That's insulting. It's human, Candace replied. The microphones captured a faint breath, Meghan steadying herself. So, let me get this straight, Meghan said. You bring me on, under the guise of conversation, only to question my character? Candace answered without raising her voice. I'm questioning consistency. That was it. Meghan's hand dropped to the armrest, fingers gripping it. You know, she said, her voice no longer smooth, this is exactly why women stop engaging with spaces like this. Candace tilted her head. Or, she said, why some people stop being able to control the narrative. Meghan stared at her. For a moment, it looked like she might laugh again, or stand up, or say something that couldn't be walked back. Instead, she said quietly, "I don't think this conversation is productive anymore." Candace nodded once. "That's your call." Meghan glanced at the cameras just for a split second, and in that moment, it was clear. This wasn't going the way she planned, not even close. The tension wasn't just rising anymore, it was about to break. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The microphones picked up the smallest sounds, the faint hum of the studio lights, the soft shift of fabric as Meghan adjusted in her chair. The silence wasn't awkward anymore. It was heavy, final. Candace Owens sat still, hands folded, posture unchanged. She wasn't leaning forward now. She wasn't pressing. She didn't need to. The conversation had reached the point where momentum carried itself. Meghan broke the silence first. "I want to be very clear," she said, her voice measured but strained. "I came here expecting a respectful exchange. What I'm getting instead is suspicion dressed up as curiosity." Candace nodded once. "And I want to be equally clear," she replied. "Respect doesn't mean agreement. It doesn't mean protection from difficult questions." Meghan's lips pressed into a thin line. "You keep calling them difficult questions," she said, "but they're loaded. They assume bad faith." Candace's tone stayed even. "No, they assume responsibility." That word again. Responsibility. Meghan let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "You say that like it's neutral, like it hasn't been used to silence women for generations." Candace didn't react emotionally. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't raise her voice. "Responsibility isn't silence," she said. "It's ownership. And ownership becomes uncomfortable when you're no longer the one setting the terms." Meghan leaned back, shaking her head slowly. "This is exhausting," she said. "Every time I speak, someone like you shows up to explain why I shouldn't." Candace corrected her gently. "That's not what's happening here." "Oh?" Meghan snapped. "Then what is?" Candace looked directly at her. "This," she said, "is what happens when a story meets scrutiny." The air seemed to tighten. Meghan's composure finally cracked. Not explosively, not theatrically, but visibly. Her shoulders stiffened, her tone sharpened. "You're benefiting from tearing me down," she said. "That's what this is. You know exactly how your audience reacts to this kind of framing." Candace inhaled slowly, then replied, "My audience doesn't need me to tear you down," she said. "They're listening, just like I am." Meghan's voice rose half a notch. "No, you're not listening. You're waiting to trap me in contradictions." Candace shook her head. "Contradictions don't need traps. They reveal themselves." That sentence landed hard. Meghan stared at her, eyes flashing. "You know what's ironic?" she said. "You accuse me of controlling narratives, but you've already decided who I am." Candace answered without hesitation. "I decided to ask questions. The answers are yours." The silence returned, but sharper now. Meghan glanced off camera, then back at Candace. "This is exactly why I stopped doing spaces like this," she said, "because they pretend to be neutral while actively hostile." Candace leaned forward slightly for the first time in minutes. "Neutrality doesn't mean comfort," she said. "And hostility isn't disagreement." Meghan shook her head. "No," she said. "This is hostility. You're questioning my motives, my integrity, my character." Candace's reply was calm but firm. "When someone's public story changes depending on the room," she said, "questions aren't personal, they're necessary." That was the line. Meghan's hands tightened on the armrests. Her breath quickened just enough to be noticeable. "I won't sit here," she said, voice tense, "and be dissected by someone who's made a career out of invalidating women's experiences." Candace didn't raise her voice. She didn't even frown. "I'm not invalidating your experience," she said. "I'm challenging your conclusions." Meghan laughed again, this time louder, sharper. "Oh, please, that's semantics." "No," Candace replied. "It's accountability." Meghan stood up. The movement was sudden but controlled. Her chair shifted back with a soft scrape against the floor. She didn't look at Candace right away. She adjusted her jacket, squared her shoulders. "This conversation is over," Meghan said. Candace remained seated. "That's your choice," she said quietly. Meghan finally turned toward her, eyes blazing. "You know what?" she said. "You don't want a conversation. You want a confrontation." Candace met her gaze. Confrontation happens when narratives can't answer questions, she said. Not when questions are asked. Meghan shook her head, incredulous. This is unbelievable, she said. You invite me here under the guise of dialogue, and then you ambush me. Candace didn't move. There was no ambush, she said. There was no script, just answers you didn't expect to have to give. Meghan exhaled sharply, reaching up to unclasp her microphone. I'm done, she said. I won't be part of this. She placed the microphone carefully on the table, deliberately, almost ceremoniously, then picked up her bag. Candace watched her without expression. As Meghan turned to leave, Candace spoke one last time. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't chase. Walking away doesn't make the questions disappear, she said. It just means they were the right ones. Meghan paused for half a second at the doorway. She didn't turn back. The door closed softly behind her. The room felt suddenly empty. Candace sat in silence for a moment, hands still folded, eyes fixed on the space Meghan had just occupied. There was no victory in her expression. No satisfaction, just calm. Finally, she turned slightly toward the camera. This wasn't about winning, she said. It was about honesty, and honesty is uncomfortable when it isn't rehearsed. She paused. We'll be right back. The screen faded, and somewhere outside that quiet studio, the conversation had already escaped into headlines, debates, and arguments that would last far longer than the podcast itself. Not because someone walked out, but because someone finally refused to look away. If this conversation made you uncomfortable, curious, or made you rethink what you just watched, that's the point. These moments don't end when someone walks out. If you enjoyed this story, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next conversation that refuses to stay quiet.